Hi, everybody. We are now going to look at something very exciting that we've been kind of teasing you with for a while, which is how to get rid of the need to use this header file, this library ic210.h. So you know that this ic210.h file is a special library of functions that we've been using so far to help us get started. But at this point, we've pretty much learned everything we need to know to use the real thing in C and not need to use this crutch anymore. So before we look into what this is, let's actually look at the file. Here's a terminal window, and if I open up ic210.h, it's a little bit more complicated, contains a few things that we're not used to, but let's try to see what's here and what we can learn from it. So there's some includes. So far, we've only seen include ic210.h, but you can see that inside ic210, it includes these other things. So when we don't use ic210.h anymore, we're going to have to include these standard libraries ourselves. Then it has a few definitions. So here's a definition of the type C string. We'll talk about that. And then it also has some function definitions, just these 5 functions: read char, read string, read num, write num, and string eq. So really what ic210.h gives us is 3 types. And the types that it gives us here, I'll type them, are stream, string, and bool. And then there's also 5 functions that we get from ic210.h, which are write num, read num, read string, read char, and string eq. And so what we're going to see in this unit is how to get the same functionality as all of these things without having to include that library. And we'll just take it piece by piece, but you'll see that it's at this point it's not too hard, and we don't need to use these things in this way anymore. So the first thing to talk about, and kind of the easiest one, is a library called standard bool. So include stdbool.h. So if you put this at the top of your file, you can probably guess what it gives you. It gives you the bool type in your program. And there's some historical reasons, like why isn't the bool type actually is built in to the recent versions of C. But what, if you care, the reason why you still have to include this is just to get it be called bool. So one of the interesting aspects of C to me is that the language has evolved and grown since it was first developed many, many decades ago. And so originally, C didn't have any bool type. You just used ints, and you said 0 is false and anything non-zero is true. Then when they decided to include the bool type, the problem is that a lot of people had already made their own type called bool in their own programs. And so if the people designing the C language said, okay, now here's bool, and then that would conflict with code that people had already written. One of the interesting things about C is that code that was written 30 years ago in C still works and should work if it's according to the C standards, should still work on your computer today. And so what they did was they said, okay, well, we're going to have the bool type like built into the language available, but you don't get to use this name bool unless you manually say include stdbool.h in your code. So you just have to write that line, and now you have the bool type. It was actually always there, but now it's accessible with that name. So that kind of checks off this type. We get that by including bool.h. Okay, another easy one, which you haven't seen this include statement, but we've been talking about these things for a while now, which is stdio.h. stdio.h. Notice that we use angle brackets here. That's to include the standard libraries. We use the quote symbols with like ic210.h to include non-standard libraries or things that we're just using. So that's stdio.h. And what does this give us? Well, you can probably guess what it gives us at this point. This gives us the functions that we've been using recently, like fscanf and also scanf and fprintf, as well as printf and fopen. So when we've been using fopen, that was already in this standard library. And actually fputs and fputc are also in there, as well as many more that you can look up in the standard documentation that's linked from the website. But mostly we'll be using these things, scanf, printf, and fopen. And because of that, we don't need to use those other things like readchar and those other ones. So now we have... Oh yeah, there's one more thing I should mention about that. And in terms of types, what stdio.h gives us is the type file. And remember, file star is the same as stream. So wherever we use stream before, now we can just use file star. So going back to our list of what comes from ic210.h, now we can say, hey, so we got the bool from doing like include std bool. And then we can also get stream type. We don't really need to use this anymore. We replace this with file star. If we don't need to use write num anymore, we can use printf instead, or fprintf. And read num, read string, and read char, we can do all that with fscanf, as we've already learned about. And those things are all available if we sharp include stdio.h. Okay, so now all that's left is a little bit about the string things. So what's the next? We talked about standard bool.h, standard io.h. The next one is called string.h. Not a very creative name, which is kind of good, so it's easier to remember. And what does this give us? Well, it gives us a number of functions that we've already been using, like strcat and strcopy, for example. But it doesn't give us this type, and it also doesn't give us the string equal function. Does not have string eq. Okay, so how do we get the functionality of string eq? And how do we get the type cstring? So the first thing is to think about this type cstring. So what is cstring? Cstring is an array of chars. You don't have to understand everything about arrays yet, because we're going to really learn about arrays in a couple weeks. But for right now, all you need to know is that before main, put this line, which is typedef char cstring 128. And so what does this line actually do for us? So here's the magical line that you need to include, that you need to type before main. So it defines a new type. So cstring is the name of the new type. And the syntax of this is a little bit weird, but what this syntax says is that a cstring is an array of 128 chars. Now, is there anything magical about 128? Not really. It's a power of 2, so that's kind of convenient, but you could make this be 200 or 256 or some other number that you want. We picked 128 in the header file because we figured that's longer than most individual words or strings that you would deal with. But if you knew that your program is going to be dealing with longer strings, actually now you have the power to control what that is and make that be longer and shorter as you want. So this is how we can get the type C string, is just by doing a type def and declaring this new type as an array of 128 chars. And we'll learn more about arrays in a couple weeks. And then the very last thing is the string equal function. So just remember that if I have like C string A and B, then string equal, what does this do? This returns true or false if A and B are the same string, if A and B have the same contents. So that's not a standard string library function, but what is from string.h, the standard string.h, we get strcmp, string compare. And this one works a little bit strangely, but once you get used to it, it'll be fine, but that's why we didn't introduce it right away. So strcomp, this returns one of three possible kinds of values. So it returns an int, and what is that int going to be? There's three cases. So if A and B are equal, if A and B are equal, then it returns 0. So it's kind of the opposite in that sense, that this function returns true if they're equal, which is true is like 1 and false is like 0. So when this one returns 0, that's kind of like saying that they're not equal. And strcomp works in the opposite way, that if the two strings are equal, then it returns 0. Then otherwise it does alphabetical order comparison. So that's the new thing that we haven't been able to do before. So if A comes before B in alphabetical order, then it returns something negative. It's actually, so it could be -1, but it could be -10 or negative something else. It just returns some negative int. And lastly, as you can imagine, otherwise, if A comes after B, returns positive. Okay, so strcomp is a little bit strange because it has these three cases. A lot of times we use it just for equality comparison. So if you want to check whether two strings are equal, previously you might have said something like, if strcmp name Dan, then we might say like printf like you're terrific, because people named Dan are terrific. And sorry, this is using the string eq function. That's what I meant to say. So that's how we might have previously done this, to say that if your name is Dan, then you're terrific. And how would we change this using strcomp? We would change this to say that if strcomp name Dan is equal to 0, then printf you're terrific. Okay, so the strcomp is really the same thing as string equal if we compare it to 0. But otherwise, strcomp can also be used to compare greater than or less than 0 to tell the alphabetical ordering of two strings, which can be useful if we want to put names in order or something like that. Okay, so going back to what we started with here, now we can see that what else do we need to have is we also need to include, in general, we also need to include string.h. And then for the C string type, I should have written C string here. For the C string type, we do this type def, which is type def char C string square brackets 128 or whatever size you want. And now for string EQ, we're not going to use that anymore. We're going to use strcmp. So these are all a bunch of small changes. This printf and scanf you're already used to, but the string stuff is a little bit new. But it's just a couple small changes in your program that you'll get used to pretty quickly. Let's look at an example of not using this ic210.h header file, and we'll just have a really small one. Whoops. So hi.c. Okay, let me start by writing my main, and then we'll go and fill in the other things. So I'll say int main, and what do I want to do? I want to just have a string for your name and say, what is your name? Then scanf and read in that name. And then I'll just say, hello, your name has this many letters. So what's going to fill in for the string is going to be the name, and what's going to fill in for the number of letters will be the strlen of name, which is a standard C function. Okay, so that's our main, but what do I have to have before main to make this all work? This would work if I did include ic210.h, but now I don't want to do that anymore. So what do I have to do instead? Well, I'm using printf and fflush and scanf, so I need to include stdio.h, and I'm using a string. And particularly, I'm using the strlen function, so that's going to come from the string.h header file. And then because I'm using this C-string type, I need to do this weird typedef line, which you can also find in the notes and just kind of copy-paste into your programs, which is typedef char C-string 128. And of course, I could change this shorter or longer, but 128, it's usually much better to overshoot on this. If you undershoot on the length, then you can have real strange problems in your programs. Okay, so this no longer needs the ic210.h thing at all. And if I compile it, you can see that I did something wrong. Very interesting. So I got an error, which is that the type returned by strlen is a size t, but I put %t here. So we could solve that by making probably the easiest thing is to make a variable. Namelen equals strlen of name, and then I'll just use namelen here. We could have also done a cast, and the reason why that had a different type is because hypothetically strings could be huge, long length things in our programs, like much longer than fit inside an int. But that hypothetical will not happen in this program, so we don't have to really worry about it. Okay, so there's our program now. What is my name? Batman, I'm Batman. And hello, Batman, your name has 6 letters. Okay, so there you have it. There's a program which doesn't use ic210.h at all. We're still going to allow you to use ic210.h on the upcoming project and everything for 6 weeks, your exams. But after that, we're not going to let you use ic210.h at all. So you can get started now of just not using it. You don't need it. That was kind of our training wheels. Now we're riding a real bike by ourselves, and hopefully that feels good.